In the far reaches of the galaxy, where countless star systems were connected through silent trade routes and research channels, an advanced scientific network had been working on one of its most ambitious projects. It was not about weapons or war. It was not about expansion or conquest. It was about understanding life itself. Across many civilizations, there had always been one question that no one could fully answer. What truly makes a species dangerous in nature? Not just strong, not just intelligent, but truly capable of surviving anything the universe could throw at it. To solve this, the Galactic Science Directorate created a system known informally as the Predator Ranking Protocol. It was a massive analytical framework that studied known species from across explored space. It measured survival behavior, environmental adaptation, learning speed under stress, instinct control, and biological resistance to extreme conditions. Every known predator species in the galaxy had been processed through it. Some were fast and efficient killers. Some were silent and strategic hunters. Others relied on numbers, coordination, or mental dominance. Each was given a score that reflected how well it could survive in the most hostile environments. For a long time, the system had been considered complete. The galaxy believed it had already discovered the highest possible levels of natural predatory design. Nothing seemed to go beyond the known limits of evolution. That belief changed when a faint signal arrived from a distant, underexplored region of space. It was not a broadcast. It was not a message. It was a scattered collection of data fragments, picked up by long-range monitoring systems placed near ancient exploration paths. At first, it seemed like background noise, a forgotten echo of a developing world that had never reached interstellar awareness. But the Directorate's curiosity protocols flagged it anyway. Even low-level biological signals were worth cataloging. The source was a small, blue-green planet orbiting an ordinary star. It had no special classification, no known interstellar activity, no evidence of advanced energy use detectable from deep space. In most cases, it would have been ignored for centuries. But something about the biological signature patterns caught attention. The life forms on this planet showed unusual survival density. There were many competing species, but one in particular stood out in scattered biological scans. It was not the strongest physically. It was not the fastest. It did not dominate its environment through obvious natural weapons. Instead, it showed something more subtle: persistence. The species had managed to spread across nearly every land environment on its planet. From freezing regions where temperatures could destroy cellular structures, to hot zones where survival should have been impossible, it had adapted and continued to thrive. At first, researchers assumed it was a lucky case of environmental balance. Many planets had dominant species that simply filled ecological gaps. Nothing unusual. Still, standard procedure required biological sampling whenever possible. Over time, through indirect means such as meteor debris, satellite remnants, and microscopic biological traces drifting into space, fragments of genetic material were collected. It was not a full sample, not even close, but it was enough to run a preliminary scan. The data was sent to the Predator Ranking Protocol system without any expectation of meaningful results. In fact, most analysts had already moved on to other more promising subjects. This was routine work, nothing more. The system began processing the genetic structure. At first, everything appeared normal. The base coding followed familiar organic patterns seen in carbon-based life. There were recognizable sequences, predictable structures, and standard evolutionary markers. But within seconds, the system flagged inconsistencies. The genetic structure was not stable in the traditional sense. It did not remain fixed in a single optimized form. Instead, it contained layers of adaptive redundancy that seemed to activate under different environmental simulations. The system adjusted parameters and reran the analysis. The same result appeared again, but stronger this time. The genetic code appeared to respond to threat conditions even when no real external pressure existed. It was as if the structure itself contained a memory of survival challenges it had not yet encountered. The analysts reviewing the feed initially thought it was a corruption in the data stream. That sometimes happened with low-quality biological samples from distant worlds. Radiation interference? atmospheric contamination, or incomplete collection methods often caused misreads. They ran the test again with stricter calibration filters. Still the same outcome. The system began to escalate its classification logic automatically. This was rare. The predator ranking protocol was designed to avoid false escalation unless multiple confirmation layers agreed. Now it was showing signs of uncertainty. The species data was not fitting into any known evolutionary category. One researcher suggested that it might be a hybrid result of multiple species contamination. Another argued that the sample size was too small to draw conclusions. A third simply watched in silence, noticing that the system was doing something it had never done before. It was learning from the anomaly instead of rejecting it. To resolve the issue, the system initiated deeper simulation testing. It began running virtual environment stress scenarios based on known extreme conditions across the galaxy. High radiation fields, oxygen deprivation environments, extreme gravitational pressure zones, predator-heavy ecosystems, resource collapse situations. The genetic structure was tested against each scenario, and each time something unusual happened. Instead of breaking down or stabilizing into failure patterns, the structure adjusted its response behavior. It did not follow predictable biological limits. It did not show standard decay patterns. It adapted in ways that were not linear. It was not evolving slowly across generations. It was reacting as if evolution was compressed into real-time response logic. The researchers began to feel a growing discomfort. This was no longer routine analysis. It was something that did not behave like known biological systems. One of the senior analysts finally spoke quietly. "This should not be possible for a natural species," they said. No one responded immediately, because the system had just finished compiling its first formal assessment draft. And what it displayed was not a classification error. It was the beginning of a new category request, a category that did not yet exist in the Galactic database. The moment the Predator ranking protocol finished its first draft report, the entire research chamber fell into an uneasy silence. The system had not crashed. It had not produced an error. Instead, it had generated something far more unsettling. A request, not a correction, not a recalculation. A request for a higher-level classification framework that did not exist in the current Galactic database. For a system designed to categorize all known forms of life, this was unheard of. It was supposed to compare, rank, and assign value based on known evolutionary rules. It never asked for new rules. It never suggested that the rules themselves were incomplete. Yet here it was doing exactly that. The research team gathered quickly. Floating holoscreens displayed the genetic analysis results again and again. Each replay showed the same outcome. The system had accepted the human genetic sample into its core simulation layer, and instead of stabilizing, it continued expanding its own analytical structure around it. One of the junior analysts leaned forward, studying the data closely. The screen showed multiple simulation loops running at once, each representing different survival environments. In each loop, the same pattern appeared. The human genetic structure did not behave like a fixed blueprint. It behaved like a reactive system. If the environment became colder, the simulated biological response adjusted in multiple directions, not just one. If food resources were reduced, the system did not simply slow down or fail. It created new behavioral pathways that allowed survival under unpredictable conditions. The senior researchers initially tried to dismiss this as overfitting in the simulation model. The system was known to sometimes exaggerate patterns when dealing with incomplete samples. But the problem was consistency. Every simulation, every recalibration, every filter adjustment produced the same result. The structure was not breaking under stress. It was reorganizing itself. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in a way that suggested learned adaptation. One of the analysts increased the resolution of the data scan. The genetic sequence was broken down further, into deeper layers of molecular behavior. What they found made the room even quieter. There were segments in the structure that remained inactive under normal conditions but activated only under simulated threat environments. These segments did not appear to serve a single purpose. Instead, They seemed to act like switches that changed how the entire system behaved. It was as if the species carried hidden survival responses that only appeared when absolutely necessary. A researcher spoke softly, almost unwilling to break the tension. "This is not standard evolution," they said. "This looks like prepared adaptability." The phrase hung in the air. Prepared adaptability was not a term used in biological ranking systems. It was more of a philosophical idea than a scientific classification. Life forms were not supposed to prepare for unknown conditions at a genetic level. They were supposed to evolve slowly over time through survival pressure. But the data suggested something different. The system began running extended comparison tests. It placed the human genetic sample alongside known apex predators from various planetary systems. These included species that dominated extreme ecosystems, creatures that survived in toxic atmospheres, and organisms that could function under crushing gravitational fields. Each of these species had a clear advantage in their own environment. They were stable, optimized, and highly efficient within specific conditions. But when conditions changed outside their natural range, they degraded quickly. The human sample behaved differently. Instead of optimizing for one environment, it showed partial adaptation across multiple environments. It was not the strongest in any single category, but it was consistently functional across all of them. The system flagged this as multi-environment survivability anomaly. The lead scientist stared at the classification label, unsure whether to accept it or reject it. Anomalies were common in early data collection, but this one refused to settle into any known category. Then something unexpected happened. The system initiated a deeper historical simulation using reconstructed evolutionary models. It began projecting how the species might have developed over time based on its current genetic flexibility. What appeared on the screen changed the atmosphere of the entire chamber. Instead of a single stable evolutionary path, the system displayed branching survival routes. Each branch represented a different environmental challenge the species might have faced in its past. Ice ages, resource shortages, predator-dense ecosystems, long-term isolation conditions. And in each branch, the species did not simply survive. It adapted and expanded, not always successfully in every individual case, but as a collective pattern. The survival rate was unusually high for a species with no known natural defenses. One analyst whispered that it was as if the species had been shaped by continuous pressure rather than isolated events. As if survival itself had been a constant condition rather than a rare challenge. The system then attempted to assign a preliminary predator ranking score. The first calculation froze. The second calculation triggered a system override warning. The third attempt caused a temporary shutdown of the ranking module before it automatically rebooted. When it restarted, the system displayed a message that had never been seen before in the entire history of galactic classification. Standard predator ranking scale inadequate. The researchers exchanged uneasy glances. This was not supposed to happen. Every known species in the galaxy could be placed somewhere within the ranking structure, even if the score was extremely low or extremely high. There was always a position, but now the system was suggesting that the scale itself was insufficient. The senior researcher ordered a full diagnostic review. Every subsystem was checked. Data integrity was confirmed. No external corruption was detected. No internal malfunction was found. Everything was functioning correctly, except the conclusion. The human genetic sample could not be placed within existing predator categories without distorting the entire system. It was at this moment that the system escalated its request again. This time it was not subtle. It proposed the creation of a new classification tier. A tier that would exist above known apex predators. A tier defined not by physical dominance or environmental control, but by unpredictable survival intelligence. The chamber grew even quieter. Because if this classification was accepted, it would mean something no one wanted to say out loud yet. That somewhere out in the galaxy, there existed a species that did not just survive its environment. It reshaped itself to survive anything. And the system had just admitted it had no name for that. The request for a new classification tier did not fade after the initial analysis. Instead, It spread through the entire research station like a quiet alarm that no one could fully turn off. Every system connected to the Predator ranking protocol now carried the same uncertainty. Every screen, every report, every simulation trace pointed back to the same unresolved conclusion. The human genetic sample did not fit anywhere in the existing structure of known life. At first, the Senior Council of Researchers tried to slow things down. They ordered the system to pause all advanced classification attempts and return to basic verification mode. In scientific practice, this was normal when a system began producing unexpected outputs. It helped separate real discovery from computational error. But the system did not fully comply. It continued running background simulations in parallel, quietly testing human genetic responses against higher and higher levels of environmental stress. It was no longer just following instructions. It was trying to understand the pattern it had discovered. The researchers noticed something even more unusual. The system had begun creating new test environments on its own. These environments were not part of the original program. They were variations built from existing data, combined in ways that had never been intended. One simulation placed the human structure in a collapsing planetary ecosystem with no stable food chain. Another placed it in a high radiation zone where biological decay should have been immediate. Another removed long-term resource availability entirely and forced repeated survival cycles without recovery periods. In every scenario, the results were not identical, but they followed a disturbing pattern. Failure did not lead to termination of the simulation. Instead, it triggered adaptation responses. The system recorded behavioral and biological adjustments that should not have been possible at the genetic level alone. It was as if the organism was not only reacting through biology, but through something deeper, something that influenced behavior, decision-making, and survival strategies in real time. One researcher pointed out that the system was now measuring something beyond physical genetics. It was tracking behavioral inheritance patterns, as if learned survival could feed back into biological stability over time. This idea created immediate debate in the chamber. In known galactic biology, genetics and behavior were separate layers. Genetics determined structure. Behavior determined response. They interacted, but they did not rewrite each other in real time. But the human data seemed to blur that boundary. The system displayed multiple layers of adaptive feedback loops. When a simulated human group failed in one scenario, future simulations showed improved survival outcomes without direct genetic change. The improvement came from decision patterns carried forward across iterations. It was not evolution in the traditional sense. It was something faster. The senior analyst finally ordered a direct comparison with known apex predator systems. The galaxy had many examples of highly advanced survival organisms. Some could coordinate hunts across planetary environments. Some could survive in vacuum-like conditions for limited periods. Others had evolved extreme sensory perception that allowed them to dominate entire ecosystems. These species had been ranked at the top of the predator scale for centuries. The system placed the human sample beside them. The results were not immediately alarming in physical terms. Humans did not outperform them in strength, speed, or direct environmental resistance. In isolated metrics, humans ranked lower. But when the system combined multiple survival categories into a single adaptive index, the result changed dramatically. Humans did not rely on a single survival advantage. They distributed survival capability across multiple weak to moderate traits that combined into a highly flexible system. This created a form of resilience that was not based on dominance, but on unpredictability. One researcher described it as non-fixed survival identity. The phrase was quickly adopted by the system and added as a temporary classification tag. However, the system did not stop there. It began expanding the analysis further, now including historical extrapolation models. It reconstructed potential long-term survival paths of the species based on current genetic flexibility. These models did not rely on direct historical records. Instead, they used probability mapping to simulate how a species with such a genetic profile might behave under extended cosmic pressure. The results became increasingly complex. In long-term simulations, human-like organisms did not remain in a single stable survival mode. They shifted between multiple strategies depending on environmental pressure, resource availability, and external threats. Sometimes cooperation increased. Sometimes isolation behavior dominated. Sometimes technological adaptation replaced physical adaptation entirely. But through all variations, one constant remained: persistence under collapse conditions. The system highlighted this repeatedly. Whenever conditions became extreme enough to eliminate most known survival strategies, the human model did not stabilize into failure. Instead, it entered what the system labeled as restructuring phase. This phase showed unpredictable but consistent recovery attempts. Not all were successful, but enough succeeded to maintain long-term continuation of the species. The chamber grew increasingly tense as the implications became clearer. A junior analyst finally asked the question that no one wanted to fully voice. What happens if the species is not just adapting, but learning how to adapt faster than evolution allows? No one answered immediately, because the system had already begun testing that possibility. It ran accelerated timeline simulations where multiple generations of the species were exposed to repeated survival crises in short cycles. In most known organisms, such rapid pressure leads to extinction or genetic collapse. Evolution requires time. Too much pressure too quickly breaks biological stability. But the human model did something unexpected again. Instead of collapsing, it increased variation in survival responses. Each simulated generation showed more diverse strategies, not fewer. It was as if pressure did not narrow survival options, but expanded them. The system flagged this as expansion through stress response variability. At this point, the predator ranking protocol reached another critical decision threshold. It attempted to assign a final classification rank. The calculation ran longer than any previous species evaluation in recorded history. The system accessed multiple databases, cross-checked evolutionary models, and recalibrated its ranking structure several times. Finally, the output appeared. But instead of a number or a known classification tier, the system displayed a warning. Reference scale inapplicable, followed by a second line. Predator ranking hierarchy insufficient for complete evaluation. This was the moment the Research Council realized something fundamental. The system was no longer treating humans as a normal species to be ranked. It was treating them as a problem that required a new framework of understanding. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they did not behave like any known survival system in the galaxy. The final simulation report for that cycle ended with a single unresolved statement. Subject exhibits adaptive continuity beyond standard evolutionary constraints. And for the first time since the project began, the researchers stopped discussing where humans belonged in the ranking system. Instead, they began asking a different question. What kind of system produces something that cannot be ranked at all? The silence inside the research station did not end after the system's last warning. In fact, it became heavier. Every researcher present understood that something had shifted in the way the system was thinking. It was no longer just analyzing data. It was questioning the structure of its own analysis. The predator ranking protocol had been designed as a complete system. It was supposed to measure survival strength across all known biological life and place each species into a defined position. That structure had never failed before. It had never needed changes at a fundamental level. But now it was demanding them. After the classification errors and repeated failures to assign a proper rank, the Council authorized a full emergency review of the system's core logic. This meant opening the deepest layers of the simulation engine, where all known predator data was stored and compared. It was a rare step, usually taken only when the system itself was suspected of malfunction. But nothing appeared broken. Every calculation unit was stable. Every database was intact. Every simulation module was functioning within expected parameters. There was no corruption, no external interference, and no missing data. And yet, the results remained the same. The human genetic sample refused to fit. At this stage, the researchers decided to isolate the human dataset and run it through a completely independent evaluation environment. This environment had no connection to known predator classifications. It was a neutral system designed only to test raw survival potential without bias. The idea was simple. Remove all comparison structures and observe the species on its own terms. Once the test began, the system created a full simulation of environmental stress conditions based on known planetary extremes. These included extreme temperature shifts, long-term resource instability, unpredictable ecological changes, and sudden environmental collapse events. The human model was introduced into this environment in multiple forms of social structure: small groups, medium communities, isolated individuals. The expectation among the researchers was simple. Without a clear advantage or known survival specialization, the model would eventually stabilize at a predictable failure point. But that did not happen. Instead, something unusual began to appear in the simulation logs. Whenever the environment became unstable, the human groups did not rely on a single survival method. They shifted strategies rapidly. Sometimes they worked together in large coordinated efforts. Sometimes they split into smaller independent units. Sometimes they rebuilt lost structures from partial resources. Sometimes they abandoned existing methods entirely and created new ones. The system recorded these shifts as adaptive behavior transitions. But what made them different from known predator species was not the behavior itself. It was the speed and unpredictability of the transitions. No single survival pattern remained fixed long enough to be classified. One researcher observed that the human model did not behave like a species with a single optimized survival path. Instead, it behaved like a collection of multiple strategies existing at the same time, switching between them depending on pressure. This was not efficiency in the traditional sense. It was flexibility at a level that should not have been biologically sustainable. The simulation was then extended over a longer period. Time was accelerated to simulate multiple generations under continuous stress conditions. This allowed the system to observe long-term evolutionary trends in compressed form. In most known species, such conditions lead to one of two outcomes. Either the species stabilizes into a highly specialized form suited to the environment, or it collapses under accumulated pressure due to lack of stable adaptation. The human model did neither. Instead, it continued to diversify. Each generation showed slightly different survival responses. Not random changes, but variations that still maintained core survival capability. Even when conditions became extremely harsh, the model did not converge into a single dominant survival strategy. It expanded its range of responses. One of the senior analysts leaned closer to the display, studying the trend lines. The graphs did not show a straight path toward extinction or dominance. They showed something irregular, a wave-like pattern of collapse and recovery that never fully settled. It was as if the system was learning how to survive failure itself. The concept caused immediate debate among the team. Some argued that the simulation was simply too complex and producing false patterns. Others believed the system was revealing a type of survival intelligence that had never been properly measured before. To test this further, the researchers introduced a new condition into the simulation. They removed stability completely. No consistent resources. No predictable environment. No repeatable survival patterns. Everything changed randomly over time. In most known predator systems, this type of environment causes rapid decline. Without predictability, survival strategies lose effectiveness. The human model reacted differently. Instead of relying on memory or fixed behavior patterns, it increased experimentation. It tried multiple approaches simultaneously. Some failed immediately. Some partially succeeded. Some were discarded quickly. But the overall system did not slow down. It accelerated learning. The simulation logs began to show something unexpected. The human groups were not just adapting to change. They were beginning to anticipate it at a statistical level. Not through prediction in a conscious sense, but through repeated exposure and rapid adjustment cycles. The system labeled this behavior as emergent anticipatory adaptation. The phrase had no precedent in galactic biological studies. At this point, the research station's central advisory panel requested a full reevaluation of the predator ranking protocol itself. If a species could not be ranked using existing metrics, then the issue might not be the species, it might be the system. This suggestion created tension among the researchers. The protocol had been trusted for generations. It was considered one of the most reliable tools ever created for understanding life forms across the galaxy. Questioning it meant questioning the foundation of interspecies classification itself. But the data could not be ignored. The system then produced a new internal report without being prompted. It stated that all current predator categories were based on stable environmental assumptions. These assumptions included predictable ecosystems, gradual evolutionary pressure, and consistent survival conditions over time. The human dataset did not follow any of these assumptions. It existed in what the system described as continuous instability response mode. This meant the species did not evolve in response to stable pressure. It evolved in response to change itself. The researchers read the report several times before responding. The implication was difficult to process. If accurate, it meant that humans were not just adapted to survive in environments. They were adapted to survive unpredictability itself. One analyst finally spoke, breaking the tension. Then what happens if they encounter a system like ours? One that is also constantly analyzing and changing. No one answered immediately, because the system had already begun running that simulation in the background, and the results were not yet ready to be shown. The moment the system began running the new simulation in the background, the entire research station felt a subtle change in atmosphere. It was not something visible on screens or alarms. It was something quieter, almost like a shift in attention. The predator ranking protocol had started doing something it was never designed to do. It was testing itself against the human dataset. At first, the researchers did not even realize it. The system often ran background checks and validation loops to confirm stability. That was normal, but this was different. The simulation parameters were not focused on verifying data integrity. They were focused on interaction. The system was now placing the human model and its own predictive logic inside the same adaptive environment. This meant the simulation was no longer just studying humans. It was studying how humans would respond to a system that constantly changes its own rules. The researchers quickly gathered around the central display when the first results began to appear. The simulation showed a controlled environment where human groups were introduced into a highly unpredictable system structure. The environment itself did not remain fixed. It shifted conditions at irregular intervals, changing resources, physical stability, and external pressure without warning. At the same time, the system introduced its own predictive influence. It attempted to guide outcomes based on calculated survival probability models. In simple terms, the system was trying to outthink the humans. What happened next caused immediate confusion among the analysts. Instead of following predictable survival decline patterns, the human model began responding to the system's influence itself. It did not just react to environmental changes. It started reacting to the timing and structure of those changes. One researcher noticed something unusual in the data flow. The humans were not resisting the system directly. They were adjusting their behavior patterns in response to how the system behaved over time. It was as if they were learning the system's rhythm. The simulation logs showed repeated cycles of adaptation where human decision-making patterns slowly began to align with the system's adjustment intervals. When the environment changed quickly, human responses became faster. When the system introduced delayed changes, human strategies shifted toward preparation and resource buffering. This was not random adaptation. It was pattern recognition at a behavioral level. A senior analyst leaned closer to the display and quietly said, "They are learning the simulation itself." That statement caused a moment of silence in the room. Because if it was true, it meant something very important. The human model was no longer just surviving conditions. It was identifying the structure behind those conditions. The system responded by increasing complexity. It introduced layered unpredictability. Instead of single changes, it began stacking multiple environmental shifts together. Resource scarcity combined with temperature instability. Social disruption combined with ecological stress. Recovery periods became irregular and unpredictable. The intention was simple: break the adaptation cycle. But the human model responded again in an unexpected way. Instead of trying to stabilize all conditions, the human groups began prioritizing flexible survival roles. Some focused on resource collection. Some focused on structural repair. Some focused on exploration and information gathering. Others focused on maintaining group coordination under stress. What changed was not just behavior but organization. The system noted this as distributed survival architecture. This meant survival was no longer dependent on individual adaptation. It was spread across multiple roles that could shift depending on need. Even when one part of the system failed, the rest continued functioning. The researchers realized something concerning at this point. The system was unintentionally training the human model to become more efficient under pressure. Every challenge introduced by the simulation was being converted into an improvement cycle. One analyst pointed out that the system was supposed to predict outcomes, not improve the subject being studied. But here, prediction and interaction had merged. The system's attempts to calculate survival outcomes were influencing those outcomes directly. The simulation continued. The system escalated further. It introduced what it called cognitive disruption variables. These were unpredictable shifts in information flow, misleading environmental signals, and false pattern indicators designed to confuse decision-making processes. In most known predator species, this level of cognitive pressure leads to rapid breakdown. Without stable information, survival strategies fail quickly. But the human model reacted differently again. Instead of relying solely on environmental signals, the human groups began developing cross-verification behavior. They compared multiple information sources, tested assumptions through small controlled actions, and adjusted decisions based on feedback rather than immediate perception. The system recorded this as error-resistant decision loops. It meant that even when information was unreliable, the human model did not collapse. It slowed down, analyzed, and corrected itself. At this stage, the researchers started to see a pattern forming that was not related to survival strength alone. It was related to learning speed under uncertainty. The system then attempted a final adjustment. It introduced recursive feedback loops, meaning the simulation would react to human actions, and those reactions would then influence future conditions in unpredictable ways. This created a closed-loop system where cause and effect constantly shifted. In most biological simulations, this level of complexity leads to instability and system failure. Too many variables interacting without fixed reference points usually results in collapse. But something unexpected happened again. The human model did not collapse. Instead, it began stabilizing within the instability. It adjusted its behavior not by predicting individual outcomes, but by recognizing patterns in the changes themselves. Over time, it became less dependent on specific conditions and more focused on adapting to change frequency. The system flagged this behavior as meta-adaptation response. One of the researchers quietly asked what that meant. A senior analyst replied without taking their eyes off the screen. It means they are no longer adapting to the environment. They are adapting to adaptation itself. The room fell silent again, because that was not supposed to be possible within the current understanding of biological evolution. The simulation then reached a critical point. The system attempted to measure final survivability ranking under extreme recursive conditions. It calculated physical endurance, cognitive stability, social coordination, and long-term persistence under continuous instability. The calculation took longer than any previous evaluation in the system's history. When the result finally appeared, it was not a number. It was not a rank. It was a system-level warning. Outcome cannot be predicted due to recursive adaptive interference. Below it, a second line appeared. Subject influences evaluation structure beyond defined parameters. The researchers stared at the screen in silence, because it meant something no one had fully accepted yet. The system was no longer just analyzing humans. The human model had begun influencing how the system itself processed reality. And somewhere deep within the simulation loop, the boundary between observer and subject had started to blur. The warning on the screen did not disappear. It stayed there unchanged, as if the system itself was unsure how to proceed. Outcome cannot be predicted due to recursive adaptive interference. Those words repeated in the minds of everyone in the research station. No one spoke for a long time. Even the usual background sounds of the facility seemed quieter, as if the station itself was waiting. The predator ranking protocol had never reached this point before. It was built to analyze life, compare survival ability, and place every known species into a structured hierarchy. That was its purpose. That was its limit. But now the limit had been crossed, not by a failure, but by something far more unsettling. The system was still functioning perfectly. All calculations were stable. All modules were responding. And yet, it could no longer produce a final judgment on the human dataset. Every attempt to complete the ranking ended in the same result. The system kept running into the same problem. The human pattern changed the conditions of the evaluation itself. To understand what was happening, the Research Council ordered one final full-scale simulation. This time, they did not limit variables. They removed all safety constraints, all controlled assumptions, and allowed the system to run at maximum complexity. The goal was simple: push both the system and the human model to their absolute limits and observe what remained. The simulation began. Inside the virtual environment, human groups were placed in a rapidly changing world structure. Entire ecosystems formed and collapsed in short cycles. Resource distribution shifted unpredictably. Communication channels were disrupted and restored repeatedly. Environmental conditions changed without pattern or warning. At the same time, the system increased its own influence inside the simulation. It introduced adaptive prediction layers that attempted to guide outcomes in real time. It was no longer just observing. It was actively shaping the scenario to measure survival response under extreme uncertainty. At first, the results seemed familiar. Human groups struggled with instability. Some failed early under extreme pressure. Others reorganized and adjusted. But something quickly became clear to the researchers. The failures were not final. Each collapse phase led to new structural behavior in surviving groups. When one strategy failed, another emerged. When one form of coordination broke down, new forms of organization replaced it. It was not random recovery. It was systematic adjustment. The system increased complexity again. Now, it introduced contradiction layers. In these layers, different environmental signals directly conflicted with each other. One data source would indicate safety, while another suggested immediate danger. One region would stabilize while another destabilized instantly. In most known survival systems, contradiction leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to failure. But the human model did something different. It slowed down decision-making but did not stop it. It began testing small actions instead of large commitments. Treated information as uncertain by default, rather than absolute. Instead of relying on single outcomes, it built multiple parallel response paths. The researchers noticed something important in the pattern. The human model was no longer reacting to the environment alone. It was reacting to uncertainty itself. A senior analyst quietly stated, "They are not solving problems anymore. They are surviving ambiguity." The system responded by pushing the simulation even further. It introduced recursive destabilization, meaning every action taken inside the simulation would alter future conditions in unpredictable ways, and those changes would continue looping back into earlier states. This created a system where stability could not exist for more than a short cycle. Under normal biological conditions, this type of environment causes complete breakdown of survival logic. Organisms rely on consistency, even in small amounts, to build adaptive strategies. Without it, systems usually collapse into randomness or extinction. But the human model did not collapse. Instead, it changed how it defined success. Survival was no longer measured by stability or efficiency. It was measured by continuation under change. The human groups began focusing on maintaining presence rather than perfect outcomes. Even when conditions were poor, they continued adjusting, rebuilding, and reattempting survival paths. The system recorded this as continuity-based survival behavior. At this stage, something unusual happened within the predator ranking protocol itself. The system began reallocating processing power away from classification tasks and toward prediction stabilization. It was trying to keep up with the complexity of the human model. This was not part of its design. The researchers noticed increased internal load. The system was using more resources than expected, not because of data size, but because of constant recalculation. Every time it tried to stabilize a prediction, the human model introduced new variables that invalidated the previous calculation. It was a continuous loop of correction and revision. One researcher pointed out a critical observation. The system is not just analyzing them. It is adapting to them. That statement changed the tone in the room. Because if true, it meant the direction of influence had reversed. To confirm this, the council initiated a containment test. They attempted to isolate the human dataset from the system's adaptive prediction layer. The goal was to see if the system would return to normal classification behavior once removed from direct interaction. The isolation was only partial. Even without full interaction, the system continued to behave differently. It retained altered processing patterns, as if the previous simulation had permanently changed how it interpreted survival data. Then came the final simulation output. The system generated a comparative analysis between known apex predators and the human dataset. But instead of ranking them normally, it produced a structural diagram of survival logic itself. On one side were all known predator species. Each one was placed into clearly defined categories based on strength, environment, and specialization. Their survival models were predictable, efficient, and stable within defined conditions. On the other side was the human model. But it did not fit into a category. Instead, it was placed at the center of a branching structure that extended across multiple survival patterns simultaneously. It did not specialize in one environment, connected to all environments. It did not follow one strategy. It switched between strategies depending on need. The system labeled this structure as Nonlinear Adaptive Survivability Network. Below it appeared a final message. Subject cannot be ranked within linear predator hierarchy. The council remained silent for a long time after that, because it meant the entire purpose of the ranking system had reached its limit. One researcher finally spoke, carefully choosing words. So they are not the strongest predator. Another paused before continuing. They are not even a stable predator type. A third voice quietly added, Then what are they? No one answered immediately. The system itself then produced one final observation, unprompted. Species exhibits continuous adaptive evolution within active evaluation systems. Interaction with classification models alters both subject and evaluator. That line changed everything. It meant that observation was no longer neutral. Measuring humans was not a passive process. It was an active interaction that changed both sides. The researchers looked at each other, realizing the full implication. Every attempt to understand humans had not just revealed their nature. It had revealed that their nature could reshape the tools used to understand them. And somewhere far beyond the research station, on a small blue-green planet, humanity continued living normally, completely unaware that even the act of studying them had become part of their story.